Hi, and welcome to the workshop. In this disc, we're going to be discussing everything that you need to know about working with layers as part of your show. The thing to remember is that layers are a fundamental part of any show that's created in either Gold or Producer. With that said, remember that if you're using either version of the program, this disc will be equally valuable for you. The things that you see here will be valid in both programs, and anything that I do that may be producer specific, I'll be sure to indicate for you. Now, that said, let's talk just a little bit about your layers themselves. I have a series of images here, and each image is in different resolutions. If we take a look at the status bar at the bottom of the main workspace, we can see here that it gives me details about my image, telling me that this image is 1600 by 1200. If I select a different image, notice that this one is 960 by 1280. The important distinction here is that when you're working with images that will eventually become layers as part of your show, you want to make sure that you're working with the absolute best material that you have available. So don't worry about the image resolution. When you add an image into ProShow, it automatically converts it into something that it can work with of a slightly lower file size if it's a spectacularly large image. But then when you create your final output, it's going to go back to the original source image. So the basic rule of thumb is that quality in means quality out. Now let's talk about just some basics when it comes to working with your images. If I bring an image into the slide, notice here that I can see the image in the preview, and when it becomes part of the slide, it's now a layer. And we'll talk about exactly what layers mean shortly. Let's begin by looking at a few of the basic things that you want to consider before you begin actually putting your show together. Let's start with the show options. These can be accessed by clicking on the options icon in the toolbar at the top of your main workspace. Here in the show options, you have a series of tabs. The one that we're concerned with right now is the show tab and the show settings options themselves. Here you can enter important details like the title of your show, but most importantly when it comes to working with your individual layers is the aspect ratio. The aspect ratio is the actual size of your slide frame that you see here in the preview window. Aspect ratio controls what this is going to look like on the actual output device that you use. 4:3 is typically the default, and if you'll notice in parentheses it says TV. This means that this is the standard size of most televisions out there on the market. Any television that's been made in about the last 30 to 40 years is going to include this kind of an aspect ratio. That said, you also have the 16:9 or widescreen aspect ratio. Notice that when I select this changes the look of the slide frame and it now becomes much wider than it is tall. This is the kind of aspect ratio that's used on most modern televisions, things like your LCD and plasma TVs that are becoming a commonplace item in most homes. So before you begin creating your show, you want to determine what aspect ratio you want to use for your show as a whole. This is going to have an effect on how your images appear on your slides. Notice that at 4:3, this image appears just like so, but if I were to change my slide over to 16:9 by going back to my show options, and changing the aspect ratio there, notice now that I have much more blank space to work with on either side of the image. This is especially noticeable if you have a portrait-oriented image like so. Because I'm in widescreen, I have far more area to work with on the left and right sides. So it's ultimately up to you to determine exactly what aspect ratio is going to be best suited for your final output. This means that it's often a good idea to have the location where your show is going to be played in mind before you begin creating the show. Now, in addition to the aspect ratio, once again under the show options, we have the safe zone. The safe zone is designed to display an area that allows you to make sure that your image is going to be visible on the screen. With the safe zone visible, I can see a hashed line that appears all around the outside edges of my slide frame. Let's switch back to 4:3 for a moment to better illustrate this. This hashed area is in reference to older televisions that often had large plastic bezels along the outside edge. This would cover some of the visible area, so if you had portions of your show that were outside of this safe zone region here, they might not be visible on older televisions. So the safe zone is simply there to help you determine what needs to be seen right in the middle that won't be covered by the edge of the television. Now, when it comes to working with modern televisions, things again like LCDs and plasmas, these don't have a need for the safe zone because their entire display area is visible and not covered by plastics. But simply keep that in mind if you're designing a show that you know will be played on an older television. Now, in addition to that, you can also change some of the options for your show background. The show background is not a layer, but instead a backdrop that appears behind every slide in your show. By default, this is often going to use a solid color, as seen here, and that solid color is typically black. You can change this by clicking on the Set icon next to the color, and then choosing whatever color you'd like to use. Click on Set Color to lock that selection into place. You can also choose to use an image as your background, and you can browse either from an image file on your hard drive or from a media source to select that image. If I select Add from Media Source and choose our Using Layers Workshop folder, I can click on Open. Let's go to Chapter 1's folder in the Image section, and here I can find an image of a clock that will then become my background. This appears on every single individual slide in my show. If I decide that I no longer want to use this, I can change it back to solid color. And let's say I can simply change my solid color back to black and click on Set Color. And here we can see how we can control the background that's going to appear behind everything in my show. Now remember, backgrounds are not a layer. They're simply a backdrop that's going to appear on which your layers will be visible. Finally, if you do decide that you want to use a background, keep in mind that you cannot manipulate it as far as position, motion, and that kind of thing. As one final piece, remember that scaling is an important component when you're working with any image that's part of your slides. This portrait-oriented image here is a perfect place to demonstrate scaling. If I double-click on the slide to open the options, and I go to my Layers and my Layer Settings options, notice that under the Layer Settings heading, I have the option to change scaling, and this is a drop-down list. By default, the scaling type will be Fit to Frame. Now, the frame is the actual edges of your slide itself, and Fit to Frame means that it's going to take the image that you're working with and make sure that it fits completely within that slide frame. If you were to change this to Fill Frame, it's going to increase the size of the image to make sure that it fills up your entire slide frame. But if you're working with an image that's not the exact same size as your slide frame, this may cut off portions of the image, as you can see here, where we've cut off the top and the bottom. Stretch to Frame is an option that I recommend you use sparingly, and here's why. When you choose Stretch to Frame, it's going to change the proportions of your image to make sure that it matches the slide frame exactly. And you can see here that when the proportions are changed, our clock becomes much more squat and wide than it's supposed to be. This is something that can be used with abstract backgrounds and other things, but it's usually best avoided for most other images. Finally, if you do decide that you need to work within the confines of the safe zone, you can select Fit to Safe Zone, which will make sure that the image fits within the safe zone borders, as you can see here in the hashed regions. Or you can choose Fill Safe Zone, which will fill up all of the safe zone regions, but again, just like Fill Slide Frame, will actually cut off some of the top and bottom of the image. So scaling determines the basic position and size of your images on each individual slide frame. You can change these as you see fit, working with multiple different images to make sure that everything lines up well within your frame. Now that said, we're going to move on to Chapter 2, where we'll discuss exactly what a layer is and how you can bring them in. Here in Chapter 2, we're going to begin getting into the actual details of how you work with layers and what they are once they're included in your show. So to start, let's talk about supported image formats. ProShow supports almost every major image format out there on the market. Now you can see here in my file list that I have a series of JPEGs. These are probably the best images to use in ProShow because they cut an excellent blend right between visual quality and file size. They're all relatively small, as we can see here, 580 kilobytes, 1 megabyte, 1 megabyte, 1 megabyte. So they tend to keep their file size small even if their actual resolution is quite high. Now that's not to say that JPEGs are the only images that you can work with. You can also work with much more advanced images, things like PSDs, Photoshop documents. You can also work with images like bitmaps. You can work with Targas, TIFFs, PNGs, you name it, it's probably an image format that we support. If you're using Producer, that also includes RAW files taken directly from your camera. So just about any image will work just fine in ProShow. Now that said, let's talk about how you actually get an image from your hard drive into your slideshow. To start, you browse for the location of the image on your hard drive. In this case, I'm opening up the Media Sources section, then moving to Chapter 2, and then my Image folder, where I can find these images that are associated with this chapter. And then, once you've opened a folder that contains images, they appear as thumbnails here in the file list. To add them into your show to create a new slide, you simply click on the file that you want to add, and then drag and drop it right into your slide list at the bottom of the workspace. This now becomes a slide, and the image that's within the slide becomes a layer. So that brings up the important question of what exactly is a layer? Well, simply put, a layer is an image that's added to a slide. If I double-click on this slide to open the slide options, here in my Layers and Layer Settings tab, as well as a myriad of other options within the slide options, I can see a layers list. And this is a list of every individual layer that's visible on my slide. Right now I have one, which is this single image that I added. Now what happens if I add multiple layers? Well, I can click on the Add New Layer icon, and then I can choose to add an image or a video from my hard drive. I can add an image from a media source, or I can simply make a copy of the layer I already have here. I'm going to select Add from Media Source. This then brings up all of the media sources that I have installed. Once again, we're going to go back to the Using Layers workshop source. Then I can go to Chapter 2, find the image folder, and add another image. Now we can see that I have two layers. But notice that if I look at the slide, just as it is, I can only see one of them. This is because layers are just like what you expect layers to be in the real world. They are individual slices that stack on top of one another. You can think of layers as being similar to a deck of cards or layers within a cake. If they're aligned perfectly on top of one another, you can only see the topmost layer. It's as if you're looking straight down onto the top of the slide frame. If I move layers out of the way, for example, if I shift my top layer over to the right edge of the slide frame and my bottom layer over to the left, and then I select OK, notice that you can now see both of them because I've moved my topmost layer out of the way, revealing a space to display the layer that's underneath it. So remember that layers are basically just images that stack right on top of one another. Now, you can also control the order in which layers are displayed. If I double-click on the slide to open the options, and once again I come back to the Layers and Layer Settings tabs, here, if I wanted to move my Wheel 04 image underneath my first image that I added, I simply click on it in the Layers list, and then click on the down arrow icon to move it underneath. If I click on OK, now you can see that the first image I added is on top of the image underneath it. So this is just there to further reinforce that your layers stack right on top of one another. Again, think of a cake or a deck of cards. Wherever layers are visible, you can see them interacting with one another. Now, we've seen how to drag and drop images into the slide list to create new slides with a layer attached to it. And I also briefly demonstrated how within the slide options you can click on the Add New Layer icon to browse through your hard drive or a media source package and add in a layer from that source as well. Now with that said, remember that it's important that you not move your images around. One thing to note is that when you add an image into your slideshow, it does not actually copy the image into an actual show file. What it does is ProShow simply references this image's location on your hard drive. If you open the show later and the image has been moved, ProShow won't be able to find it and will let you know that you need to locate it. So it's recommended that you put your images all into one place while you're building your show so that they don't move around on your hard drive. That means that ProShow will be able to locate the images that make up your show every time when you get started. So now we understand exactly what a layer is and exactly how you go about creating them. Let's get into some more details about exactly how you can work with layers and what you can do with them. Moving on to Chapter 3, we're actually going to talk about exactly how you control both the position and the size of your individual layers in a bit more detail so that you know exactly how to work with the layers that you have. What I'm going to begin by doing is creating one slide that has multiple layers attached to it. And here's where a very useful keyboard shortcut comes in. What I'm going to do is select 4 image layers, and I can do this by holding down Control and then clicking on each image that I want to use in the file list. While Control is held down, that means I'll select multiple images. So you can see there that I now have 4 images selected. To add them all to one slide rather than creating 4 different slides, I will hold down Control and then drop them right into my slide list. Notice that this has created one slide. The way I can tell that I have multiple layers attached to this slide is via this little icon that appears in the lower left-hand corner of your slide thumbnail. This series of what looks like a stacked pieces of paper is actually the indicator that there are multiple layers attached to this slide. If I double-click on the slide to open the options, and we look at the layers list, here we can see that all 4 of those images that I selected have been added to this slide as layers. But remember, because they're all the exact same size, the only layer that I can see is the topmost layer because it fills up my entire slide frame. Now let's talk about exactly what you can do to control, resize, and adjust these layers. The options for positioning your layers can be found once again here in the Layers and Layer Settings tab of your slide options. All of the settings that you can adjust are found right here in Layer Settings. First, we have the scaling, which is what we took a look at in Chapter 1. This changes the overall size of your layer in relation to your slide frame. Next, we have the position. This is the actual location of your image on the grid that makes up your slide frame. 0 by 0 is the exact center of your frame. Next, we have the zoom value. This is the actual size of your image layer. And finally, we have aspect ratio. This is an advanced setting that I wouldn't recommend you adjust for any images attached to individual slides. Rather than setting your aspect ratio for individual images here, it's best to set it as I showed you in Chapter 1 using the slide options. So let's talk about adjusting the position and zoom of your individual layers. The preview window, which appears here in the upper right, is by far the easiest way to work with your layers because you can make adjustments visually. If I want to change the position of a layer, I can simply click and drag that layer to place it wherever I want it to appear on the slide frame. Notice that as I do this, the position values for both the horizontal on the left and the vertical on the right update to reflect where I've placed that layer. So you don't need to know precise values in order to place your layer where you want it to appear on the slide frame. I can also change the size of my layer by adjusting the zoom value. So I can reduce the size of this layer so that it's more easy to see the other layers that I've also included on this slide. So using a combination of zoom and position, I'm going to arrange these layers so that I can see one of each in all 4 corners of my slide. So I'm going to reduce the zoom value of this layer to about 40%. And if you don't want to try and get that exactly by working with the slider, you can manually type in 40% in the numeric field. With this done, I can simply place this image layer down here in the lower right-hand corner. Now I can make the same changes to layer 2. I can select layer 2 in my layers list, and this brings it up as the layer that I'm currently working with, and we can see that this is set similar to layer 1. It fills up the entire slide frame. So I'm going to begin by changing the zoom value of this layer to 40% as well by typing that into the zoom value field, and then I'll position this layer by dragging and placing it right in the upper left-hand corner. Now there are some shortcuts that you can use here to make it easier to work with multiple layers at one time. For example, I know that I want to continue to use this 40% size value for all of the layers on my slide. So rather than doing this manually for every layer, I can simply copy this setting to the other layers on my slide. To do this, I right-click on the value and then choose Copy Zoom to all layers on this slide. That means that every single layer on my slide will now have a zoom value of 40%. So if I select layer 3, you can see it's set to 40%. And if I select layer 4, you can see that it's also set to 40%. So that can be a very useful shortcut to make sure that you can get those layers changed to exactly what you want to work with. Now to complete the visuals here, I'm going to take layer 3 and I'm going to move it into the upper right corner. And finally, I'll take layer 4 and I'll move it to the lower left corner. So now we can see that I have changed the size of my image layers and positioned them all so that I can see all 4 of them on the slide simultaneously. Now that said, there are also a few options that you can use to control how your preview window behaves. I'm going to double left click on the slide again to open the options, and here in the preview window I'm going to access these options by right clicking. This brings up a submenu that gives me a series of options I can use to control how the preview window behaves. The first option is Show Composition Lines. This displays a series of blue lines that help you visually arrange your image layers on your slide. This is most useful if you're attempting to follow the rule of threes, that is, balancing the visual weight of your slide into equal thirds. Here we can see that I've placed each slide relatively within all of those grid places on the 4 corners. If composition lines are distracting your arrangement, you can always turn them off again by right-clicking and choosing Show Composition Lines. The visibility of the safe zone can be turned on or off simply by choosing Show Safe Zone from the same submenu. If you're not working with a slideshow that requires that you follow the safe zone, it's usually best to turn it off, as this makes it quite a bit easier to see what you're working with on your slide. Next, we have the behavior of inactive layers. An inactive layer is any layer that's not currently selected. By default, it's set to darken inactive layers. What this means is that any layer you do not have currently selected will be darker in your preview window. So notice that right now layer number 4 is full bright, the other 3 layers are slightly darker. If I choose layer number 3, it becomes full bright and the other layers become darker. I can also choose to hide inactive layers. This means that any layer I don't currently have active will not be visible. I'd recommend that you use this particular option if you're working with a very complex multiple stack series of layers. But unless you're working in a situation like that, I'd recommend that you not use this option because it can be a little confusing. Finally, we have Show Inactive Layers. This simply means that all the layers that aren't currently selected will be visible just as they normally would be. Darken inactive layers is probably the easiest and most natural way to work, as it makes it very clear which layer you have selected while still showing you the other layers that are present on the slide. Next, we have Activate Layer with mouse click. When this option is enabled, you can select layers simply by clicking on them within the preview window. So instead of having to come down to the layers list, choose the layer that I want to work with, and then make changes in the preview window, I can simply click on the layer that I want to adjust and then move its position, change its zoom value, or anything like that right here. Finally, Show Layer Outlines is what enables the blue outline and anchor points that you see around my selected layer. If the outlines are distracting or not beneficial for you, you can always right-click and then uncheck Show Layer Outlines. So those are the preview window options that you have to control exactly how your preview window behaves to make it easy as possible for you to work with your layers. So we've taken a look at exactly how to adjust and position your layers. Moving on now, we're going to take a look at how you can edit the visual appearance of your layers. Not only can you determine what their size is and where they're located on the slide, but you can also change how they look, everything from color balance to their general color settings. Here in Chapter 4, we're going to learn how to edit the appearance of your layers. Now, we switched over to Producer because in addition to the gold options that are available for changing the appearance of your layers, Producer has a few additional things that it can do that we're going to illustrate here. Now, keep in mind that until we reach the end of this chapter, all of the options for editing are both common to Gold and Producer and can be found in exactly the same place. So let's begin with the option to rotate or flip your image layers. All of these editing options can be found by double left-clicking on the slide and then selecting the Layers and Editing tab. Here in the Layers and Editing tab, you're given the option to change all sorts of attributes about your images. You notice that you have things like adjustments. Producer users can adjust opacity and blur, while Gold users have access to the rest of these options, such as brightness, white point, etc. Then we have a series of editing tools that allow you to rotate or flip your image layers, as well as Producer users being able to add vignettes, and then both being able to remove red eye or crop images. You can add color overlays to your images, you can add outlines and drop shadows, and Producer users also have access to a feature called Chroma Key Transparency, which allows you to make solid color regions of your images completely invisible. So let's begin with rotation or flip. Rotation can be done to your layers by simply clicking on the rotation drop-down box and then choosing the amount of rotation that you want to use. 90 degrees, which we can see here, 180 degrees, or finally 270 degrees. Notice that when you look at your image, you can see what it was before editing in the lower right-hand corner and after editing just beneath that, so that you can see what the difference between the changes are as far as the original image and the changes you've made. So let's rotate this image 90 degrees, and we'll leave it just like that. If I click on OK, notice that that change is immediately reflected in the image as it appears in my slide preview. Next up, we have red eye removal. It's very, very common to find a photograph like this, where you have someone in the photo who has red eye in place on the image. Rather than going into an external image editor and removing the red eye, then bringing that image into ProShow to use as part of your show, you can make the red eye correction right here in ProShow. To do this, double left click on the slide and go to the Layers and Editing tab, and then select the Red Eye option under the Editing Tools section. This brings up the Red Eye Removal tool. Now here we can see that we've already removed some red eye from this image. I'm going to delete those, and notice that we have some directions for how to use the tool. We can left click and drag to create an area to remove red eye, and we can also use the mouse wheel to zoom in on the image. So to get a better look at the eyes of my photo here, I'm going to use my mouse wheel to zoom in deep into this image, and then I'll drag the image with my right mouse button so that I can get a good look at the eyes. With this done, I'm then going to use my left mouse button to drag a selection area just around the red eye regions themselves, trying to preserve as much of the eye as possible. With that done, the red eye has now been removed, and I can simply click on OK. Notice now that the image is updated immediately to reflect the red eye removal. If you decide that you no longer want this enabled, all you have to do is simply uncheck the box next to the option. Checking it again turns it back on. So it makes it a very simple process to come into your images and remove red eye. Click on OK, and those changes are applied immediately. Moving on, let's take a look at cropping. Cropping is the ability to select just a particular part of the image layer that you want to see. Notice that in this image layer we have some white on the left and right edges of the image that might be an artifact from scanning it. So let's just focus down on the couple themselves and less on the environment around them. To do this, once again, I'll double click on the slide to open the slide options, and I'm here in the Layers and Editing tab, and here I'm going to choose Crop, once again in the Editing Tools section. This brings up my Crop dialog window. This dialog window is very simple to use. All you need to do is left click and drag to create a cropping region, and then you can position by dragging and change the size of your cropping region by clicking on the anchor points to adjust its overall size and placement. Once you have a crop that you're happy with, simply click on OK. The image will then be adjusted and rearranged to support the crop that you made. Click on OK, and you can see that change reflected immediately. So it's very simple and very straightforward to make any minor changes to images that you need to make in order to get them to look as good as possible. Moving on, let's take a look at color correction and auto color correction. This allows you to balance out the color and white point levels inside your image to make sure that the colors are as distinct as possible. To do this, once again, I'll double click on the slide to open the options and come into the Layers and Editing tab. Now the auto color correction is found in the Adjustments section just here to the right of your brightness, white point, and black point values. Clicking on the Auto button will cause ProShow to take a look at the image layer and attempt to balance out the white point levels to something that it thinks is correct. Notice that this has made the sunlight more vivid and brought the color depth of the image quite a bit more in line with what it should have been. If you're unhappy with the auto correction results, you can always left click on the reset arrow icon next to each value that it changed to bring it back to its defaults. You also have the ability to drag any adjustment slider. You can increase the brightness or decrease it. You can increase the white point or decrease it. Same with the black point. Contrast. Hue you can use to change the overall colors of your image. Sharpen causes the individual pixel edges of your image to become more distinct. This is something you may want to use sparingly, as too much sharpen can cause your image to look very artificial. Blur, which is a producer-only feature that allows you to introduce your own blur into the image. And opacity, which once again is a producer feature, allows you to make your image able to be seen through. And again, remember, autocorrect helps balance out those color values for you automatically. Click on OK, and that change is applied immediately. Moving on now, we have a section of what we call special adjustments. In this case, we have a series of images here that have been set up in a collage. We have a background image behind them and three images that are stacked on top of one another. Remember, using our layer stack knowledge, this layer that's on top of them all is layer number 1. We have layer number 2 in the middle, stacked on top of layer number 3 back behind it. Now, special adjustments allow us to add in visual extras that help make your layers a bit more distinct. For example, here in slide number 11, we added a combination of outline and drop shadow. If I double click on the slide to open the options, and I go to the Editing tab, you can see that for each layer we've enabled an outline and set the color to white, and we've enabled a drop shadow and left its color at black. The drop shadow appears along the outer edge of your image layer. It's a little difficult to see here, but it does appear just along the bottom and right corners, and that's simply there to give your image a sense of visual depth. Now, with that said, outlines help make the edges of your image a bit more distinct, and producer users have the ability to change the size of the outline as well as the opacity of the drop shadow. Now, if you want to make things even more distinct, we have the examples we created in slide number 12. Here, we added some colorization to each one of these image layers. If I double-click on the options here, we can see Colorize has been enabled for layer number 1, and the color has been set to gray. If you look at the before and after editing comparison, the gray color overlay makes this image look as if it were black and white. You can change this color overlay to anything you'd like. You can make a red, you can make a green, or any other color that's available. The same thing was done for image layer number 2, except that instead of doing a black and white, we chose a tone that makes it look almost as if it's a sepia-style photograph. So colorization, again, can be toggled on and off, and producer users have the ability to control the strength of it, so that it's a very powerful colorization or a very subtle colorization. And now we're moving on to producer-specific effects. For this particular slide, the soft edges around this image were created using what's called a vignette. If you remember photos that were often taken during the turn of the 19th to 20th century, you can recall that a lot of older photographs had a soft feathered edge around them. This is the traditional application of a vignette. This feature is found in the Editing Tools section under Vignette, and if you click on this button, it opens up the Vignette configuration window. Here you have the ability to choose the shape of your vignette from a rounded rectangle to an ellipse, and then you can choose the type of vignette that you want to use. The most common is transparent because it makes all of the outer regions able to be seen through. You can also choose solid color or gradient to control exactly how you want your vignette to appear. From there you can adjust the size of your vignette, making it softer or harder edged based on personal preference. You can also increase or decrease the border size of your vignette, and you can determine things like filling the corners or borders if you're working with a rounded rectangle. You can also change the gradient if you've selected that, or the color if you're working with a solid color edge. By default, a rounded rectangle with the transparent edges will give you this soft, rounded edge along the outside of the vignette. Combine this together with an outline and a drop shadow, and you get a very visually distinct look, which has a border around the outside of the image, but then soft along the inside. Our next example slide is the same vignette, however, we simply removed the border. And in slide number 16, what we've done here is added in a background image, and this image has a vignette applied to it. So what this does is softens the top and bottom of the image, and that just makes for a more visually distinct and interesting background. Finally, one of the most interesting editing features available in Producer is Chroma Key. This feature allows you to make certain key areas of your image transparent. So in this case, we made this green color that appears around the subject of the photo completely transparent using Chroma Key, which allows us to see an image layer behind it. So if I open the options for this slide, you can see that we have our topmost image layer, the shots of the fireworks behind it, and then just a slight abstract background. Notice that Chroma Key has been enabled and configured for layer number 1, which is what makes that green region transparent, as you can see in the After Editing section. So those of you using Gold, remember that all of the adjustments that we looked at prior to the Producer section are available for you to use. That includes rotation, red eye, cropping, color correction, and any special adjustments. Finally, Producer users have access to vignettes and Chroma Key to further enhance the things that they can change on their slides. Here in Chapter 5, we're going to be talking about how you can add layers together and begin creating some very distinct and interesting visual depth as part of your overall composition. This is going to contain a series of examples, and you're more than welcome to follow along. The content for this chapter is found in Chapter 5 and the Image section underneath your Media Sources entry. To begin, our first slide is going to illustrate how you can add some visual distinction with some simple drop shadows and outlines to make your layers look more interesting. So to begin, I'm going to create a new slide that contains 3 images: Abstract 06, Airplane 06, and Airplane 12. To select all 3 of these, remember that I hold down Control and click on each layer that I want to include. With this done, I can add all of them to a new slide by holding down Control and dropping them into my slide list. This has created a new slide with all my image layers in place. Now, I'm going to begin by double left clicking on the slide to open the slide options, and I'll go to my Layers and Layer Settings tab to get my beginning configurations out of the way. Let's start with the background. I'm going to select my background, Layer 3, and I want this to fill up my entire slide frame because it's just acting as a simple backdrop for my image layers. To configure this, I'll change the scaling to Fill Frame. This makes sure that my background fills up my entire slide frame area. Next, I'm going to select Airplane 06, and I'm going to use the up arrow icon to move this to the top of my layers list. And then I'm simply going to reduce the size of this image layer. I'm using my mouse wheel to do so. You can use the slider or your own mouse wheel, to about 40%. Then I'm going to place this layer in the upper right-hand corner of my slide frame. Next, I'm going to select Airplane 02, or 012 rather, and I'll reduce the size of this one using my mouse wheel as well to about 60%. With this done, I have an interesting visual arrangement in place on the slide. From here, I'm going to make a few small adjustments to get everything looking just the way I want it to. To begin, I'm going to continue to reduce my image layer number 1 down to 30% and then shift it up to the right a little bit more. Here's where the interesting accents come into play. I'm going to go to my Editing tab, and here, for both Layer 1 and Layer 2, I'm going to enable both an outline and a drop shadow. So, I'll check the outline option for layer number 1 and the drop shadow option for layer number 1. Next, I'll move to layer number 2 and do the exact same thing. Check outline and check drop shadow. With these options enabled, I believe our slide composition should be finished. I'll click on OK. And there we can see that with no motion at all, we've managed to create an interesting looking slide without having to go through and do any kind of heavy adjustments. It's simply the selection of a quality background that works well with our images and an interesting visual arrangement of those images in the foreground. Now let's move on to another way to make layers immediately more interesting. Let's talk about the use of borders. I'd like to make this image my main focus of my next slide, but I want to spice it up a little bit by adding a border to that image, which I can see right here. So to begin, I'm going to create a new slide by dragging Airplane 15 into the slide list. From here, I want to add a photo border along the outside edges of this slide. Now to do this, I need to locate my border and add this border as a new layer. Now the reason this is going to work is because this file is a PNG, and PNGs support transparency. ProShow also supports transparency. So this white region that you see in the middle can actually be seen through. And transparency can become an incredibly powerful way to combine images together. So what I'm going to do is add this image as a new layer right on top of slide number 2. To do this, I'll hold down Control and drag and drop that border right on top of the slide I just created. Now we can see that the transparent border gives me a viewing area right in the middle and looks almost like a photo frame. The only major problem that I have here is the frame is a bit too small. So to make an adjustment to this, I can double left click on the slide and go into my Layers and Layer Settings tab. And from here, I'm simply going to zoom in on my border to increase the size of it and give me more room to see the plane. With that done, click on OK. And now we can see that we have an interesting visual arrangement just by adding a border to the image. It doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. Now, transparency can also be used in more interesting ways. For example, here I have a shot of an airfield, but the sky has been removed and made transparent. This was done in an external image editor like Photoshop to get me prepared to use this picture as part of my overall next slide. So what I'm going to be able to do is add visual depth to my slide by having two different layers. So I'm going to start by adding in this picture of the airplane once again as my bottommost layer. And you'll see why I'm going to be doing this in just a moment. So I'm going to drag and drop this into the slide list to create slide number 3. Then I'm going to select my transparent airplane image, and I'm going to add this as a new layer to slide number 3. So I'll hold down Control and drag and drop it right on top of the image I just created. Now notice that because the sky area of this image is transparent, that means that I can see the cloud layer of the photo behind it, and that again is the shot of the airplane. So this is going to give me some visual depth by adding a little bit of motion to my sky in the background. Watch how this works. I'm going to double click on my slide to open up the slide options, and I'll start by selecting layer 2, and I'm simply going to increase the zoom value of layer 2 and pan down a little bit so that I can't see the plane that's part of this image. With that done, now I'm going to create some very simple motion to add some visual depth. To do this, I'll go to the Effects and Motion Effects tab, and here in the ending position, I'm simply going to pan this image over so that the cloud layer appears to move a little bit. Producer and Gold both create motion by looking at the difference between the starting and the ending position. Because in the starting position my image is centered, but in the ending position it's been pulled over to the left, it's going to have some panning motion in that cloud layer. Click on OK, and if I play this back, now you can see that the clouds move independently of the foreground, giving my slide a great sense of visual depth. Now let's take this just another step further. Here I have a shot of an aircraft sitting on a runway getting ready to start up. But I also have this interesting transparent shot of some propellers that might work really, really well on the engines of this aircraft. So I'm going to give this plane some moving propellers. To do this, I'm going to create a new slide using this picture of the airplane. And then I'm going to add in two propellers to be used with it. To do this, I'll select my propeller, hold down Control, and then drop it on top of the slide. And then I'll do the same thing again a second time so that I have two propellers, which you can see right there in the middle of the slide frame. Now I'm going to double click on the slide to open the options, and I'm going to go back to my Layers and Layer Settings tab. Here I'm going to manually position each propeller so that it appears right on top of the engine that it's associated with, just like so. So you can see that I've now placed those propellers. And once they're adjusted into a good position, now I'm able to go in and add some motion to them. To do this, once again, I'll go back to my Effects tab and then into Motion Effects. Here, in the starting position for layer number 1, I'm going to start it at a rotation value of -360, and in the ending position, I want it to have a rotation value of +360. Then I'm going to choose layer number 2, and in the starting position I want this one to have a rotation value of about -270, and then finally an ending rotation value of +360. Now, why did I offset this one slightly different from layer number 1? I did that so that they don't rotate at exactly the same speed. That's going to add a little bit of visual variety to them. With that done, click on OK, play the sequence back, and there we can see that our propellers rotate to make that slide more interesting. So the entire point here is that not only can you place layers on slides and arrange them visually, as long as you have a solid eye for composition, as we've done here in slide number 1, or just a good sense of what makes a great looking slide, as we've done here in number 2, you can add quite a bit of depth with just simple tools like outlines, drop shadows, or borders. To make things even more interesting, you can have multiple layers of your composition so that one layer moves while the other doesn't to give yourself some interesting visual depth. Or in our final example, just an interesting little accent to make your photo a bit more exciting. Moving on, we're going to continue to look at all of the interesting kinds of things that you can add into your layers to make your slideshows really stand out. Here in Chapter 6, we're going to learn exactly how you can create controlled and measured motion that you can use with all of your layers together to create some very interesting effects. We're also going to emphasize the importance of time and the importance of transitions as they relate directly to the motion that you create. Our first example is going to be a moving photo album, as you can see from the folder list here. And what we're going to do is take this series of 3 images, stack them on top of one another, and then cause them all to move one at a time into corners of your slide. That's going to make for an interesting visual composition, while our image here is just a simple background that will appear on each one of the slides. So let's get started by creating the new slide with all of our image layers. Once again, I'm going to hold down Control and select all 4 images in my folder list. Then I'm going to continue to hold Control and drop them into my slide list to create a new slide with all of the images in place. Now, before we begin setting up motion, it's important that we get the visual starting point for this slide firmly established. So, I'm going to double-click on the slide to open the options, and I'm going to start by making sure that all of my layers are in the proper order. To do this, I'll click on the Layers and Layer Settings tab, and I'm going to begin by moving Layer 1, which is going to serve as my background, all the way to the bottom of my slide list to make sure that it's underneath every one of those photos. Then, just as I did in the previous chapter, I'm going to change my background scaling option to Fill Frame so that it fills up my entire slide display area, so it just serves as a simple backdrop. Now, because I'm going to want to be able to display all of my photos within the same slide frame, I'm going to need to reduce their size. Let's try bringing their size value down to about 40%. That gives me a decent amount of visual room to have these move about on the slide, so I'll change each one of them to 40%. Now in this case, I'm not using the copy option because if I were to do that, it would also reduce the size of my background image to 40%, and I've already established that where I want it to be. So in this case, it's a little bit faster for me to simply manually change each one of my layer values to 40%. With that done, I'm going to go to my Editing tab, and here I'm going to enable a drop shadow for each one of my photos just to make them stand up from the background a little bit more than they already do. With that set, if I click on OK, you can see that I now have the basic visual arrangement for all of my images. Now here's where timing begins to become a factor. When you start working with motion, the time of your motion becomes very important. 3 seconds is about the standard time for a slide, and 3 seconds of transition is generally the default transition for your slides. This means that your total slide time is 3 seconds plus 3 seconds for a total of 6 seconds. That means that your image will have 6 seconds to move from the starting position to the ending position, however you may arrange that. That's something to keep in mind as you begin establishing motion, and we'll see how this works as we start getting our first example put together. So what I'm going to do here is I want to begin by taking my topmost image layer, and I want to move it into the upper left-hand corner of my slide frame. To do this, I'm going to go to the Effects and Motion Effects tab. So here in the ending position, I'm simply going to place my image layer in the upper left-hand corner, just like so. Now, as I mentioned previously, ProShow creates motion by looking at the differences between the starting and the ending position, so it automatically knows that if the image starts in the middle but ends in the upper left, it simply needs to pan across to reach that position in the upper left. If I play the slide back using the preview button here on the left side, we can see that that layer will simply move up to the upper left corner, just like so. Now, that image layer is moving rather slow, and that's because it's got a grand total of 3 seconds of slide time and 3 seconds of transition time to make that motion. To make this move a little bit faster, I'm going to reduce my slide time down to 1 second, and let's see if that picks things up a little bit. Now we can see that the layer does move quite a bit faster. From here, what I want to happen is now I want my second image layer to also begin panning out into the corners. Now here's where we begin to run into an interesting scenario. To do this, I'm going to need to create a second slide. But the second slide is going to have to be visually identical to the ending position of my first slide. Otherwise, it'll be very obvious to the audience that I'm making a transition between two slides. So here's a useful tool to make sure that those stay the same. I can click on the copy icon here in the preview toolbar, and I can select copy end to next slide for all layers. What this is going to do is copy the ending position of every layer on my slide into a new slide right next to it. I select this, we'll go through each one of those layers, and now notice that the starting position of slide number 2 exactly matches the ending position of slide number 1. So if I play this back, they should blend very well into one another. But there's a problem here. Notice that as I reach the transition between the two, the image layer moves into the corner, but then it hits this transition, which is a blend between the starting position of slide number 2 and the final ending position of slide number 1. It gives it this sort of ghostly movement effect. Now what I want is for this to appear like seamless motion. To make this happen, I need to change my transition time to 0 seconds. What this now means is that my slide and my layer have to complete the motion right at the end of the actual slide time. With no transition, it's going to immediately jump to the beginning of slide number 2. But since that motion is already complete and the ending position of slide number 1 perfectly matches the beginning of slide number 2, there's no visual distinction there. So if I play this whole thing back, you'll see that the layer moves, and then I jump to the next slide without there being any visual indication that I've done so. And that's exactly how you tie this kind of effect together. Now, because that moves pretty quickly, I think I can take the slide time back up to 3 seconds so that we have a more gradual motion, and then we leap to the next slide, because ultimately it's the transition time that determines that behavior. Now for slide number 2, let's continue on to finish the effect. I'm going to choose layer number 2, and I'm simply going to pull it down into the lower right-hand corner, like so. With this done, just as I did previously, I'm going to select the copy icon here in my preview toolbar and choose copy end to next slide for all layers. This will create a slide number 3 whose starting position perfectly matches the ending position of slide number 2, and then I'll change my slide time, or my transition time rather, to 0 seconds. So now if I play this back, we'll see the first slide move. Then we'll seamlessly move to slide number 2, which will also begin to move. And finally, we'll see them all for a moment in slide number 3 before we reach the end of the effect. So your transition types and your timing are incredibly important for how your slide behaves. The type of transition you use can also influence this, as we're going to see in our next example. For example number 2, we're going to combine some transparency and some motion together, as well as a different kind of transition to see exactly what happens here. So for this, I have an image of an open door. This open door is transparent inside the middle of the door. So for this effect, I'm going to start by bringing in this picture of the ocean, and I'm going to create a new slide with this image. With that created, I'm now going to bring my door in and add it as a new layer right on top of this slide. So I'll hold down Control, drag, and drop it right there on top of it. Notice now that this gives me a view of the ocean inside the doorway. With this established, I can double click on the slide, and here I'm going to go through and set up some interesting motion effects. Here in my Motion Effects tab, I'll select my picture of the ocean. And let's say, since we can only see the image of the ocean inside the doorway, that in the starting position I want it to be focused on the sun, and perhaps in the ending position I'll use my mouse wheel to zoom in a bit and have it just pan down or perhaps across the horizon line to get a view of the surf. With this done, I'll click on OK and play the effect back, and then you can see that we've done that depth effect again by having a transparent item on top and moving layers underneath it. But we're going to refine this effect a little bit, and to do this we're going to transition to a shot of these woods appearing within the same door. So to do this, I'm going to create a new slide right after it, and then I'm going to add the door on top of it again, just as I did in slide number 4. So I'll hold down Control and drop it right on top of slide number 5. Now, without any motion added to my next slide, we can see that as we transition from one to the other, the door appears to remain identical. And that's because the door is in exactly the same place for the entire sequence, which means that even though there's a transition taking place, the door does not appear to change. So let's add a little bit of motion to my forest here in slide number 5. Again, I'll double-click on the slide to open the options. I'll select slide number 2. And let's start with a zoomed out view of the road, and then let's just do something simple like zoom in to appear as if we're moving down the road, just like so. With that done, click on OK, and now we can play the sequence back and see that we have the moving ocean, which then fades into the moving scene of us appearing to walk down the path. Now with this done, we can change the way this happens by changing the transition between the two. I can click on the transition between the two slides to bring up my transition chooser. The transition chooser allows me to pick a particular kind of transition that I want to see take place here. Let's try something subtle like this transition effect here, which is a softened plasma effect. And you can see a preview of what that's going to look like down in the lower left-hand corner of the transition chooser. With my plasma effect chosen, let's play this back, and now we can see that we have the ocean moving, and then it makes almost this burnout type of an effect as it moves on to our scene of the ocean. So not only can you change transitions to 0 seconds to blend multiple step motion pieces together, you can also use your transition as an artistic accent to a sequence of slides to add a little bit more visual interest to them. For our final chapter of the disc, we're going to look at 3 distinct examples to see how you can combine the knowledge we've gained when it comes to adding layers to your slides, controlling their appearance, as well as their motion to make some very interesting looking arrangements. Our first example is going to demonstrate exactly how adding and removing borders from your images can be a very effective way to make an interesting show. So what I'm going to do is start by adding all 5 of my images here into a new show. So I'll simply select those 5 images and drag and drop them into my slide list to create new slides. And then I'm going to make an exact duplicate of each image so that I have 2 of the same image appearing all the way throughout my show. With this done, it's a good look at exactly how you can put together a quick yet very effective show that works really, really well. Now the other part of this is I'm going to add a border to each one of my image pairs, but leave the second image in the pair without a border. So I'll hold down Control and drop a border on my first, my third, my 5th, and then let's move on to the 7th, 9th, and we should be complete at this point. So we've added a border to each one of these slides. And now from here we can go in and control exactly how we're going to determine what that border is going to do. So for example, for slide number 1, I can go into my Layers and Layer Settings tab, and here I could do something simple like change the zoom value of my border. Let's increase the size of it to, about 160%, looks pretty good. Click on OK, and then we'll just do the same thing for each one of the borders across our show. Now keep in mind that you can also copy this setting, although you need to be a little selective about exactly how you copy it out to make sure that you don't change the size of your image layers as well. With this done, I'll get all of my sizes changed. And now we've got our borders arranged and ready to go. Oops. Let me make sure that you actually change the size of your border. There we are. So now our borders are all the same size. And we can see here that you can always make an interesting show just by removing the border in unique ways. So, for example, if we were to watch from the beginning of the show, here we can see that the border is in place, and then when we reach the transition, the border fades away, revealing the entirety of the image. Now, by changing transitions, you can make the removal of these borders more interesting. So, for example, I can click on the transition between slide number 1 and 2, and here I can use a circular wipe. And then let's say I can click on the transitions between slides 3 and 4, and here I can use something like a paintbrush effect. Moving on to slides number 5 and 6, perhaps I could change this to be a double radar effect. So each one of these makes for an interesting and unique way to get rid of the border. Here we can see that the circular wipe removes the border in a progression across the edge of the image. And then we move on to our next image, and from here we'll bring back the border with a different image, and then we'll use paintbrush strokes to remove the border from this image. So there's all kinds of different ways to add visual variety to your shows, and this is just a simple example of how you can use borders and unique transitions to make the visuals of your show more interesting without requiring a significant time investment. Now let's delete these slides that we've created, and we'll move on to our next example, number 2. And in this example, we're going to see again how motion and transparency can be very, very important parts of putting an interesting looking slide together. Here I have an image of a flower and an image of a bird with a transparent left edge. So what we're going to do here is add both images to one slide and then blend them together. I'll select the bird and then hold down Control and select the flower, then hold down Control and drop them both into my new slide. Now I have both images added to a new slide. I need to change their order and their visual arrangement to blend them together a little bit. To do this, I'll double left click on the slide to open the options, select my bird and move it to the top of my layers list. Then I'll choose my image of the flower and pull it over to the left side so that they're nicely blended together. If I click on OK, you can see how the edges of those are now merging into one another thanks to that feathered transparency in the bird image. Now I can still see the edge of the flower, which means that I need to change their zoom values a little bit before I go in and add motion. So to do this, I'm going to begin by increasing the zoom size of the bird and panning it over to the left some, and then perhaps just increase the zoom size of the flower a bit, and now the border should no longer be visible, just like that. Now, to make this more interesting, let's set up some opposing motion. I'm going to arrange it so that the bird zooms toward us and the flower zooms away from us. This contrast in zoom values is going to create a sense of visual depth that you'll often hear called parallax. To do this, I'll go to the Effects tab, and here in the Motion Effects, in the ending position, I'll increase the zoom value of the bird, and then I'll select Layer 2, and in the ending position, I'll decrease the zoom of the flower. The values don't have to be very dramatic at all. I only changed each one by about 10%. With that done, click on OK, and if I play the sequence back, you can see that the bird zooms in while the flower zooms out, and that gives you an interesting sense of visual depth that appears on the slide. Now, for gold users, the bird image was prepared with transparency on the left side in Photoshop. Producer users can create these kinds of effects without an external image editor at all using the masking feature. If that's something you're interested in, please see the masking DVD that we have available. Now for our next example, we're going to combine these two images of koalas to create a similar effect. This image of the koala has transparency on the right side. So to begin, I'm going to create a new slide using this background picture of the sleeping koala. And then I'm going to drag this image of the active koala and drop it right on top of the slide as a new layer. With this established, I'm going to make some visual changes and adjustments to the slide to make it look a little bit more interesting. I've opened the options for the slide, and I'm going to begin in the Layers and Layer Settings tab. Here, I'm going to start with my background, and I'm simply going to increase the zoom value of the background, but move it over to the right edge of the slide frame, just about like so. Then I'm going to choose my top layer, layer number 1, and I'm going to reduce its size down to about 50% and position it right here along the left edge of the image, just off center a bit. Now I'm going to make a few visual adjustments to the slide. I'm going to start by changing the background color to white. So to do this, I'll click on the Slide tab, then choose the Background tab. I'll check Override Show Background for this slide, which allows me to choose my own background color for this one slide. Select the Solid Color Radio button, and then change the color to white. With that done, let's go back to the Layers tab, and I'm going to make a few visual changes to these layers as well. Under the Editing tab for layer number 1, I'm going to enable an outline, and then I'm going to select layer number 2, and I'm going to use some colorization on layer number 2. And here, I'm going to click on Set Color and just find kind of a nice, soft, bluish type color. Let's adjust that a little bit, just like so, kind of a blue-gray. With that done, let me click on OK to take a look at my composition. That looks pretty good, just like so. Now to finalize this effect, again, I'm just going to add a little bit of motion into place. To do this, I'm going to open the slide options, go to the Motion Effects tab, and for layer number 2, I'm going to start just by increasing the zoom and panning the layer over to the left just slightly. With that done, click on OK, and let's play the sequence back. Here we can see that the layer moves while the image of the koala stays still, but the interesting outline and the blend of the transparency on the right edge make for a very unique visual composition that works well with the motion. Now we have one final example left, and this one combines a little bit of motion along with some slide timing and transition to make for an interesting looking exploding image collage. I'll open the folder for example number 3, and here we can see a series of images of a cityscape. I'm going to add all of these images to a new slide by holding down Control and dragging them all into the slide list. With my new slide created, I'm going to begin by opening the options for the slide, and I want to start by reducing all of these image layers pretty significantly down in size because I'm going to want to be able to see all 5 of them simultaneously. To do this, I'm going to go to the Layers and Layer Settings option, and let's start by trying 40% as our zoom value. Now that looks like it might work pretty well, but why don't we drop it down a little bit more and try 30%. That's probably going to be a bit more successful with 5 image layers. With this done, once again, I'm going to right-click on the value and choose Copy Zoom to all layers on this slide. That will then make all of them the same 30% size. And before I begin creating the motion and making the arrangements, I'm going to change the background color of this slide to white as well. That'll just make it a little bit more clean. I'll click on the Slide tab and the Background tab, check Override Show Background, and change my background color to white. With that done, I'm going to add a drop shadow to my image layers just to give it a bit more of a modern look. So I'll go to the Layers tab and then select Editing. And from here, I'll enable a drop shadow for my first image layer. And then I'm going to right-click on the option and choose Copy Enable to all layers on this slide. That'll make sure that every single one of my image layers has a drop shadow. Now with this established, I'm ready to create the motion. Because this is going to be an exploding image collage, I'm going to go to the Effects tab, and what I want to see here is I want image layers 2 through 5 to rotate and then move into all 4 corners of the image. Layer number 1 will stay right there in the middle. So let's start with layer number 2. In the ending position, I'm going to place layer number 2 into the upper left-hand corner, just like so, and I'll give it a rotation value of -360, so that it rotates as it moves into that corner. Let's choose layer number 3. I'll pull it down into the lower left, and I'm also going to give it that same rotation value of -360. Layer number 4 we'll put in the upper right, and again we'll use the same rotation value. Get that just there into position like so, and we'll use the same rotation value of -360. And then last, layer number 5 we'll pull down into the last available corner, and again we'll use the same rotation value of -360. With that set, I'll click on OK. Let's play this effect back, and we can see that those image layers spiral out into their corners. Now there's a bit more that I want to do with this effect. Once their image layers reach their corners, I then want the center image layer to zoom in toward us to complete the effect and then fade to black. Well, this is very similar to that photo album arrangement that we made just a few chapters ago. To do this, I'm going to need to make a copy of this slide and then change the transition time to 0. So I'll open the options for the slide, and again, just as we did with the photo album, I'm going to click on the copy icon in the preview toolbar. Once again, that's in the motion effects options, and I'm going to select copy end to next slide for all layers. Now, one thing you need to keep in mind here is that I copied the ending position to the next slide for all layers. But remember, the background is not a layer, so that custom background color did not copy along with it. That's fine. It just means that we have one quick extra step to do to change our background color back to white. With that done, now we have an ending position or a starting position that exactly matches the ending position of our previous slide. To clean this up a little bit, I'll change my transition time to 0 seconds. And let's play what we have so far. The images move out into their corners, and then we move right into slide number 2 without any delay. To complete the effect, for slide number 2, under the motion effects, I'm simply going to select image layer number 1 and zoom in until it's bumped up to about 65% in size, just like so. With that done, let's go back and play the sequence. We can see that the image layers explode outward toward the corners, and then the center image layer zooms in toward us just to finalize the effect. So over the course of this workshop disc, we've learned what layers are, how you can work with them, how their size is relative to the position of your slide frame, and then from there we looked at how you can adjust their position and their size. We've looked at exactly how you can change their appearance, and we've combined those settings together with motion to create some of the interesting effects that you've seen here at the end. I hope you've enjoyed this workshop disc, and I hope you've learned quite a bit from it. If you enjoyed this disc, please feel free to look at the others that we have available, in case you're interested in features like keyframing, which makes this kind of motion in ProShow Producer much easier, or masking, which allows you to make blended image layers just as you saw in our previous example without having to go to an external program. Thank you very much for watching.